We want to talk about random selection at the level of human consciousness, but in the context of the argument for choice in nature, which we will refer to herein as the argument. The argument basically states that true randomness can only be modeled with the introduction of spontaneous conscious choice, meaning that we cannot demonstrate randomness without conscious involvement. Any randomization number algorithm, for instance, will only be pseudo-random, producing number strings that appear random but which are nonetheless ordered in some way. If events in nature are truly random, then they can have no rules whatsoever governing what happens whenever a contingency arises, which at the quantum level is practically every instant. And if our ability to model random events is taken to be an indicator of their actual nature, then we should conclude that choice is involved in every random event, otherwise nature would only be pseudo-random. This is valid reasoning. The only question is whether mathematical modeling can be taken as a reliable indicator of how what is perceived to be genuine randomness in nature occurs. For the purpose of this presentation, we assume the affirmative, and so from this, three possibilities emerge. Either there is an objective consciousness everywhere in nature that makes blind spontaneous choices whenever there is a contingency in the timeline. There could also exist quantum consciousness inherent in the material that provides the conscious mechanism, and that it is so subtle that it has thus far eluded detection. And of course, these two possibilities are not mutually exclusive, and so both could actually be operant simultaneously. This scenario requires that events in time are not deterministic, which we will also assume to be the case. Later, we will discuss the potential for directed quantum choices, as the probability of life evolving by pure chance is so astronomically low. Since quantum consciousness will be perceived as less disruptive than entertaining the possibility of universal observation, we start out with the former and with a traditional model of universal development and the evolution of life. And so we can see that through quantum consciousness, matter bootstraps itself up into greater and greater degrees of complexity. Then we can ask two main questions. What role does human consciousness play in the unfolding of random events? And secondly, what role does randomness play in the decisions we make? With respect to the first question, it is apparent that if all else holds, human consciousness, if it can cause truly random events, will only be sufficient to cause them to take place and not necessary. When it comes to the second question, we have to think about the inherent organizational structure of the human brain. Of course, if consciousness is needed for truly random events, it wouldn't make much sense to talk about randomness governing formative decisions or real-world decisions unless it is that randomness associated with quantum consciousness. This form of randomness is undoubtedly involved to some extent with human consciousness. We have two forms of randomness in human consciousness to consider: formative decisions and spontaneous actions. By formative decisions, we mean both the early personality-forming decisions as well as things like political affiliation and opinions on the world that form our worldview. It seems clear that such decisions are not random, for they defy statistical randomness. That is to say, that we can accurately predict beyond 50-50 chance whether someone is likely to be Republican or Democrat, for instance, based on a number of external factors. It is important that decisions like these are not random because it denotes the inherent organizational structure of the human brain, but also the willingness for individuals to identify with the environment with which they are most familiar, namely family environments. As an example that human consciousness does not on its own function randomly, whenever we attempt to say random words, it becomes evident that the mind is naturally inclined to make associations between words, and that it becomes difficult to fight against this inclination. Of course, a little bit of looking for patterns could also be involved here. Also, this example requires a foreknowledge and awareness that one is attempting to think in a random manner, thus affecting the results, which appears to be somewhat analogous to the double-slit experiment. This is by no means a complete exploration of the subject, but we will say that it begins to seem as if randomness is the exception rather than the rule. When we allow for the argument for choice in nature, anywhere else we look for randomness, it will appear to be experimental, forced, and unnatural, requiring laboratory-like conditions. Randomness, then, would be rendered a simulation that is never truly divorced from the observer. Returning to formative choices, preferences, etc., it is interesting that some of the stances we come to adopt end up being shocking to others. This appears to be due to a combination of factors. On one hand, we know that since all known worldviews constitute incomplete and subjective analyses of reality, and since different worldviews are clearly possible, it becomes the case that people with differing views will occasionally find some of those views shocking. An incomplete worldview should contain some elements that are incorrect, either factually or from the perspective of an objective observer, and should actually be shocking when one is theoretically in possession of all facts and able to correlate them in an unbiased manner. At the same time, there appears to be an element of electrochemical arousal for people knowing that others are shocked by what they believe. We feel relieved when we see the shock of others and then reconfirm and re-justify our own belief system, giving us the sensation that we have some esoteric or inside information. And who doesn't want to feel special? We need some worldview as the basis for operating within the world, and at some point, if we have a gap that needs to be filled, we will most likely pick what is most familiar, or popular perhaps, or we may decide to take a counterintuitive stance. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it is something that can be factually proven or not. Some people choose to believe that the earth is flat. It's patently absurd, and there is no good evidence for it. The world is an oblate spheroid, and yet some people choose the shocking view that the world is flat in defining and completing their base axioms, any of which, knowing the nature of human beings, are subject to change in certain cases. Some people will never be swayed in their beliefs, however, and this is likely one of the main sources of human conflict. But human conflict, in and of itself, is not a bad thing, not something we should wish away, because in my estimation, human conflict is a great conductor of novelty in the universal system. There is a certain structure that guides human thought. Human thought is limited in that it cannot go beyond the boundaries of what the structure supports, and so we are always trying to stretch the boundaries and break them, so as not to feel confined or limited, as it is part of the human nature to transcend limitations. The mechanical structure and confines of human thought can give the appearance that it is automated and that we do not have free will. However, with respect to the argument for choice in nature, as long as we are assuming that quantum consciousness exists, it can't be the case that human consciousness is automated, otherwise it would not be a complex extension of the former. Where, again, given the argument, quantum consciousness and/or universal observation are necessary to give contingent events a random distribution. It is therefore better, given our assumptions, that we think of human consciousness as free, autonomous, and independent, but nonetheless limited to a loosely defined and finite space. For instance, we cannot know anything about subjects that we aren't able to gather any reliable information about. This would be a limitation. If consciousness is necessary for random events to properly occur, then we don't even need randomness as a mechanism to build up to human consciousness. if it is inherent and always bootstrapping quantum consciousness, if it is inherent and always bootstrapping itself up to greater and greater degrees of complexity. Here we run into the question of whether quantum consciousness is capable of making more than just blind selections. As previously mentioned, when we look at the statistical probability of life arising by pure chance, it becomes apparent to any reasonable person that there is some other mechanism at work besides randomness, and thus it is that we find ourselves discussing the possibility of some conscious mechanism. We must also distinguish between determinism and free will. Even if it is the case that no random events occur without conscious input, this ruling out of independent and natural randomness does not automatically indicate that reality is wholly deterministic as an antithesis to randomness, as again, we need the freedom of thought to make spontaneous choices, otherwise any random events will only be algorithmic and pseudo-random.